Picture a German tank commander standing in the frozen ruins of a French village in the winter of 1944, his hands trembling not from the cold but from disbelief. Through his binoculars, he watches another column of American Sherman tanks rolling toward his position, the third wave he has seen that day. His crew had destroyed 5 enemy tanks that morning, celebrating each kill with grim satisfaction, believing they were winning the battle. But now, as the sun begins to set, he sees 10 more Shermans advancing where 5 had fallen, and behind them the shadows of dozens more waiting in reserve. His voice cracks over the radio as he reports to headquarters, and the response from his general is silence, a long, heavy silence that speaks louder than any words. This moment, repeated across every battlefield from Normandy to the Rhine, would become the defining nightmare of German military leadership in the final years of the Second World War. The shock was not just about numbers or machines. It was about the complete collapse of everything they thought they understood about warfare, industrial capacity, and the limits of human production. What they were witnessing was not merely an army, but an industrial titan that had awakened from its slumber and now unleashed a torrent of steel that would never, ever stop coming. In the early years of World War II, German generals had every reason to feel confident about their armored superiority and their understanding of mechanized warfare. Their panzer divisions had swept through Poland in weeks, crushed France in months, and driven deep into the Soviet Union with a speed that shocked the world. The German military leadership had created a doctrine called Blitzkrieg, which meant lightning war, and it relied on fast-moving tank formations supported by aircraft and motorized infantry to punch through enemy lines and create chaos in the rear areas. The Germans had not only developed excellent tactics, but also produced some of the finest tanks in the world during the early war years. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were reliable, well-armored, and equipped with guns that could handle most opponents they faced. German tank crews were superbly trained, often spending months learning their craft before seeing combat, and many had years of combat experience by the middle of the war. The generals who commanded these forces, men like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, were considered geniuses of mobile warfare, and their successes seemed to prove that Germany had unlocked the secret to modern combat. The German war machine operated on certain assumptions that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. They believed that wars would be short, that superior quality could overcome numerical disadvantages, and that their enemies lacked both the industrial capacity and the technical skill to match German production. Most importantly, they assumed that destroying enemy equipment would gradually wear down their opponents until they could no longer continue fighting. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the German High Command did not immediately grasp what this would mean for the future of the conflict. America seemed far away, protected by vast oceans, and its military was small and inexperienced compared to the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. German intelligence reports noted that America had a large industrial base, but the Germans believed this industry was soft, accustomed to making consumer goods and automobiles rather than weapons of war. They thought American society was too comfortable, too divided, and too democratic to mobilize effectively for total war. What the Germans failed to understand was that American industry possessed something unique in human history: the ability to mass-produce complex machinery with incredible speed and efficiency. The same assembly line techniques that Henry Ford had used to make millions of affordable automobiles could be applied to tanks, aircraft, and ships. American factories were not small workshops run by craftsmen. They were enormous facilities designed for volume production, staffed by workers who understood standardization and interchangeable parts. When President Franklin Roosevelt called for America to become the arsenal of democracy, he was not making an empty promise. Within months of entering the war, American automobile plants began converting to military production. The Ford factory at Willow Run, originally designed to build bombers, became a symbol of American industrial might, eventually producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. Tank production followed a similar pattern. Factories that had made tractors and locomotives began stamping out Sherman tanks at a pace that seemed almost impossible. The M4 Sherman tank became the primary American medium tank of World War II, and to German eyes, it seemed almost laughably inferior to their own machines. The Sherman was not heavily armored compared to German tanks. Its gun was less powerful than the long-barreled weapons on later model Panzers, and it had a tendency to catch fire when hit because of its gasoline engine and ammunition storage. German tankers nicknamed it the Tommy Cooker or the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that advertised it lights the first time, every time. In individual tank versus tank combat, a German Panther or Tiger tank could often destroy a Sherman from distances where the American tank could not effectively fight back. German tank commanders who encountered Shermans in battle often felt confident they could win these engagements, and they frequently did. But this tactical superiority masked a strategic disaster that the Germans were slow to recognize. The Sherman tank had been designed with mass production in mind from the very beginning. Every component was standardized, every part could be manufactured by multiple suppliers, and the entire tank could be assembled quickly by workers with relatively basic training. The Sherman used a radial aircraft engine that was already in mass production, which meant there was no bottleneck in engine supply. Its chassis was simple and reliable, designed to be repaired in the field rather than sent back to factories. Most importantly, the Sherman was good enough. It might not win every individual tank duel, but it was reliable. It could be produced in enormous numbers, and it could be shipped across oceans and kept running in the field with minimal maintenance. By the summer of 1943, American tank production had reached levels that seemed almost fantastical. The United States was producing thousands of Sherman tanks every month, along with tank destroyers, light tanks, and countless other armored vehicles. The factories ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, employing millions of workers, including many women who had never done industrial work before. The sheer scale of production was something the world had never seen before. While Germany struggled to produce a few hundred tanks per month, carefully crafting each vehicle with attention to detail and complex engineering, America was churning out Shermans like automobiles. The statistics tell a story that German generals found difficult to believe even when presented with the evidence. In the entire year of 1943, Germany produced approximately 10,000 armored fighting vehicles of all types, including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. This seemed like an impressive number to the German leadership, representing a significant industrial effort. In that same year, the United States produced approximately 29,000 tanks, mostly Shermans, along with thousands of other armored vehicles. But the real shock came not just from the annual totals but from the sustained pace of production. German factories were constantly bombed, suffered from shortages of raw materials, and struggled to train new workers as experienced men were drafted into the military. American factories faced none of these constraints. They had access to unlimited raw materials from across the Western Hemisphere. Their factories were never bombed, and they had a workforce that grew more skilled and efficient with each passing month. When American forces landed in North Africa in November 1942 for Operation Torch, German commanders got their first taste of what American industrial production meant on the battlefield. The initial encounters were not impressive from the German perspective. American troops were inexperienced and made mistakes, and their tank tactics were sometimes clumsy and predictable. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Erwin Rommel inflicted a sharp defeat on American units, destroying many tanks and taking hundreds of prisoners. German after-action reports noted the poor quality of American leadership and the inadequacy of their equipment compared to German panzers. What troubled some of the more thoughtful German officers, however, was what happened after these battles. In previous campaigns against the British or Soviets, destroying a significant number of enemy tanks meant weakening that force for weeks or months while they waited for replacements. After Kasserine Pass, the Americans withdrew, regrouped, and within days were back in action with their losses completely replaced. New tanks arrived on trucks and trains, were quickly distributed to units, and rolled into battle as if nothing had happened. German officers who had celebrated their tactical victory began to realize they had accomplished nothing strategically. The Americans were not weakened, they were learning. Every battle taught them lessons, and they had unlimited equipment to practice with. By the time the North African campaign ended in May 1943, with the surrender of all Axis forces in Tunisia, the Americans had learned how to fight, and more importantly, they had demonstrated that their supply chain was unbreakable. When Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, and then mainland Italy in September, German defenders encountered the same frustrating pattern on a larger scale. German units would set up strong defensive positions, wait for Allied attacks, and then fight fierce battles in which they often achieved favorable kill ratios against enemy armor. A single German Tiger tank with a skilled crew could destroy multiple Shermans before being knocked out or forced to withdraw. German commanders would report these successes to higher headquarters, feeling they were bleeding the Allies dry and making them pay for every mile of Italian soil. Yet the Allied advance never stopped for long. Every morning brought new Sherman tanks to replace those destroyed the previous day. Every week brought fresh units, completely equipped and ready for combat. The Germans began to notice something that contradicted everything they thought they knew about warfare. Normally, armies grew weaker as campaigns progressed. Vehicles broke down, spare parts ran out, men became exhausted, and units had to be pulled out of line to rest and refit. But the American and British forces seemed to grow stronger the longer the campaign lasted. Their supply system was so robust that tanks received regular maintenance, damaged vehicles were quickly repaired or replaced, and units always had fuel and ammunition. German forces, by contrast, were constantly short of everything. Their more sophisticated tanks required more maintenance, parts were scarce, and the long supply lines from Germany were under constant air attack. A German panzer division that started a battle with 100 tanks might end it with 30 still running, and it could take months to get back to full strength. An American armored division that lost 50 tanks would be back to full strength in a week. Part of what shocked German generals was the fundamental difference in engineering philosophy between German and American tank design, a difference they had not fully appreciated until it was too late. German engineering tradition emphasized precision, quality, and performance. German tanks were beautifully made machines with tight tolerances, advanced features, and powerful weapons. The Panther tank had a gun that could destroy any Allied tank at long range, sophisticated optics that gave crews excellent visibility, and thick sloped armor that could bounce most enemy shells. The Tiger tank was even more formidable, a heavy tank that dominated battlefields wherever it appeared. German engineers were proud of these machines and constantly worked to improve them, adding new features and modifications. But this approach had hidden costs that became catastrophic in a long war. Each German tank model had unique parts that could not be used in other models. The Panther used a different engine than the Tiger, which used different parts than the Panzer IV. This meant factories had to maintain separate production lines, warehouses had to stock thousands of different spare parts, and mechanics in the field needed training on multiple systems. Worse, German engineers kept modifying designs even during production, which meant early model Panthers had different parts than later models of the same tank. The constant improvements and modifications made logistical support a nightmare. American engineering philosophy was almost the opposite. American designers believed that a good enough tank that could be mass-produced and easily maintained was better than a perfect tank that was rare and difficult to support. The Sherman used standardized parts wherever possible, and many components were interchangeable between different models and even different vehicles. Its engine was reliable and widely available, its transmission was simple, and mechanics could be trained quickly. When problems were discovered, fixes were designed to be simple and applicable to existing tanks in the field, not just new production. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders in France had prepared for a massive invasion and believed they could defeat it. They had built extensive fortifications along the coast, positioned panzer divisions in reserve to counterattack any landing, and planned to drive the Allies back into the sea before they could establish a firm foothold. The German plan assumed that even if the Allies landed successfully, the flow of supplies and reinforcements across the English Channel would be limited and vulnerable to disruption. In the first days after D-Day, German panzer units did counterattack, and they achieved some local successes. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend fought ferociously around Caen, destroying many Allied tanks and inflicting heavy casualties. German tank commanders reported with satisfaction that their Panthers and Tigers were superior to Allied armor and that the invaders could be contained. But then came the shock. The Allies had landed not just an army but an entire industrial system. Within days of the invasion, artificial harbors called mulberries were operating off the Normandy coast, allowing ships to unload tanks, trucks, ammunition, and fuel directly onto French soil. The volume of material flowing into Normandy exceeded anything the Germans had thought possible. By the end of June, the Allies had landed over 800,000 men and more than 150,000 vehicles. German reconnaissance reports describing the endless columns of trucks and tanks were initially dismissed as exaggerations, but as more observers confirmed the numbers, the terrible truth sank in. Every German panzer division that fought in Normandy began to melt away under the pressure. They would fight battles, destroy Allied tanks, and retreat to new positions only to find even more enemy armor waiting. When a German tank was knocked out, it might sit in a field for weeks before a recovery vehicle could retrieve it, and then it could take months to repair because parts were unavailable. When a Sherman was knocked out, an American recovery vehicle would often tow it away that same day, and it would be repaired and back in action within a week, or if too badly damaged, simply replaced with a new tank from the endless stream arriving from the beaches. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 demonstrated the fatal consequences of Germany's tank production failures. German forces in Normandy had been fighting for 2 months, trading space for time and inflicting casualties on the Allies, but they had been unable to stop the breakout. When American armored divisions under George Patton broke through German lines and began racing across France, German units were caught in a pocket near the town of Falaise. Hitler ordered them to hold and counterattack rather than retreat, and for days, German units fought desperately to keep an escape route open. The Germans abandoned hundreds of tanks and vehicles in the Falaise Pocket, not because they were all destroyed, but because they had broken down and there were no spare parts to fix them, or because they had run out of fuel and there were no supply trucks to bring more. Perfectly functional Panthers and Tigers were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture, while their counterparts in American units would have been quickly repaired or refueled. After the Falaise Pocket closed, German panzer forces in France were shattered. The divisions that escaped had lost almost all their equipment. Normal military logic suggested this would give Germany time to rebuild these divisions while the Allies paused to consolidate their gains. But there was no pause. The Allies raced across France, and within weeks, American and British forces were on the German border. German panzer divisions that had been destroyed in Normandy were still waiting for replacement tanks that would never come in sufficient numbers, while American armored divisions that had lost hundreds of tanks in the same battles were at full strength and pushing into Germany itself. In December 1944, Germany launched its last great offensive in the West, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had scraped together a powerful force of panzer divisions, carefully hoarding fuel and ammunition for months, and planned to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. For a few days, it seemed like the old Blitzkrieg magic might work one more time. German tanks pushed deep into American lines, creating panic and confusion, and some units advanced 40 miles in the first week. German soldiers captured American supply dumps and were amazed at what they found. Warehouses full of food, mountains of ammunition, rows of new vehicles waiting to be distributed, and fuel dumps with more gasoline than entire German armies had to work with. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was shocking even to common soldiers. But the offensive was doomed from the start by the same industrial reality that had haunted Germany throughout the war. The Germans had committed virtually every tank they could scrape together to this offensive, throwing their last reserves into a desperate gamble. When tanks broke down or were destroyed, there were no replacements. When the initial fuel supplies ran out, there was no more. American forces, caught by surprise and pushed back, did exactly what they had done throughout the war. They called for reinforcements, and the reinforcements came. Within days, American tank divisions from other sectors were rushing to the Bulge, completely equipped and ready to fight. Eisenhower shifted entire armies to seal off the German penetration, and every unit that moved had all the tanks, fuel, and ammunition it needed. The weather cleared after a week, and Allied aircraft swarmed over the battlefield, destroying German vehicles by the hundreds. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany had lost over 700 tanks and assault guns in the offensive, vehicles they could never replace. The Americans had lost similar numbers but had already received replacements and were preparing for the final drive into Germany. While German generals in the West were reeling from the endless flow of American tanks, their counterparts on the Eastern Front faced an even more overwhelming situation. The Soviet Union had an industrial capacity that, while less sophisticated than America's, was even more ruthlessly focused on mass production. Soviet factories produced the T-34 tank in numbers that made even American production look modest by comparison. The Soviets cared nothing for comfort, reliability, or sophisticated features. They built tanks that were good enough to fight, easy enough to manufacture, and simple enough that barely trained crews could operate them. Soviet tank production reached truly astronomical numbers. In 1943 alone, the Soviet Union produced over 24,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. In 1944, they produced over 29,000. Unlike the Germans who carefully crafted each tank and agonized over every design change, the Soviets simply built more T-34s. When German intelligence officers saw reports of Soviet tank production numbers, they often dismissed them as impossible exaggerations. Surely no country could produce 30,000 tanks in a year. But the numbers were real, and German units facing the Red Army experienced the same nightmare as their comrades in France. They would fight desperate battles, destroy dozens or hundreds of Soviet tanks, and congratulate themselves on their tactical brilliance, only to face even more Soviet armor the next day. The Germans were caught between two industrial giants, America in the West and the Soviet Union in the East, both producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. German tank production, despite desperate efforts to increase output, never came close to matching either opponent. In 1944, Germany's best year of tank production, they manufactured around 19,000 armored vehicles of all types. This sounds impressive until you realize the Soviets alone produced more tanks than that, and the Americans were sending Shermans not just to their own forces, but to the British, French, and other allies as well. German generals had comforted themselves throughout the war with the belief that quality would triumph over quantity, that their superior tanks and better-trained crews would overcome numerical disadvantages. This belief was based on real advantages. A Panther tank was superior to a Sherman in almost every measurable way. A Tiger tank could destroy enemy armor at ranges where it was nearly invulnerable. German tank crews had excellent training and often years of combat experience. In individual engagements, these advantages mattered. But war is not a series of individual tank duels. It is a sustained industrial and logistical competition, and in that competition, Germany had already lost by 1944. The quality argument failed for several reasons that German generals were slow to accept. First, the gap between German and Allied tanks was narrowing. By late 1944, Shermans were being equipped with better guns that could penetrate German armor more effectively. American tank crews had learned tactics to overcome the technical superiority of German tanks, using their advantages in numbers and mobility to flank and overwhelm enemy positions. The Soviets developed heavy tanks like the IS-2 that could stand up to German armor, and they used their T-34s in mass formation that simply rolled over German defenses. Second, superior quality means nothing if you do not have enough quantity to matter. A Tiger tank might be worth 5 Shermans in combat, but if the Americans could send 10 Shermans for every Tiger, the math worked against Germany. Even worse, if the Tiger broke down before reaching the battle, which happened frequently because of the tank's mechanical complexity, its theoretical superiority was irrelevant. Third, the focus on quality had made German logistics impossible. Every different tank model required different parts, different tools, and different training. A mechanic who could repair a Panzer IV might not be able to fix a Tiger. A supply depot had to stock parts for a dozen different vehicles, and even then often lacked the specific part needed. The Americans and Soviets, with their standardized designs, could support their forces much more easily. One aspect of the replacement tank crisis that particularly shocked German generals was the vulnerability of their own supply system compared to the resilience of Allied logistics. Germany had always prided itself on its efficient railroad network, which was considered one of the best in Europe. German military planning relied heavily on railroads to move troops and supplies, and the famous German punctuality extended to train schedules. But by 1944, the German rail system was under devastating attack from Allied bombers. Every day, Allied aircraft struck rail yards, bridges, and locomotives, creating a transportation crisis that made it nearly impossible to move tanks from factories to the front lines. A new Panther tank built in a factory in Germany might sit for weeks waiting for a rail car to transport it to France or Poland. Once loaded onto a train, it might have to detour hundreds of miles because bridges had been destroyed. Sometimes trains loaded with tanks were caught in the open by Allied fighter bombers and destroyed before ever reaching combat units. Meanwhile, the Allies had created a supply system of stunning efficiency. In France, American engineers built a pipeline from the Normandy coast all the way to the front lines to deliver fuel. Truck convoys called the Red Ball Express ran day and night, delivering supplies to advancing units. When railroads were needed, American engineers rebuilt them with incredible speed, sometimes repairing damaged bridges in days that would have taken weeks or months in peacetime. Tanks and other equipment flowed from American factories to ports, across the Atlantic in heavily protected convoys, to English ports, across the Channel to France, and then forward to combat units in a continuous stream that never stopped. The contrast was devastating. Germany could build a good tank but could not get it to the soldiers who needed it, while America could build an adequate tank and ensure it arrived at the front with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts ready to go. In the last months of the war, from January to May 1945, the disconnect between German hopes and reality became almost surreal. German factories were still producing tanks, though at greatly reduced rates because of bombing and shortages. New panzer divisions were still being formed, equipped with whatever vehicles could be scraped together. German commanders still planned counterattacks and defensive operations as if they had a functioning military force. But Allied intelligence officers touring captured German positions found a military force running on fumes and desperation. They discovered German tanks that had been abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to run them. They found supply depots where mechanics had cannibalized 3 broken tanks to make one working vehicle because no spare parts were available. They interviewed German tank crews who had received only a few days of training before being sent into combat because there was no fuel for proper training exercises. Some German units in the final weeks were using World War I-era weapons because modern equipment was unavailable. Meanwhile, Allied forces had so many tanks that some units had more vehicles than they could effectively use. The stream of Shermans continued arriving even as the war was clearly ending. American supply dumps in Europe held thousands of tanks in reserve, ready to replace any losses. When German units were finally overrun in the last battles, survivors expressed amazement at the quantity of equipment they had been fighting against. They had destroyed tank after tank, yet more always came. Even in defeat, some German officers struggled to understand how they had lost. They had fought well, their soldiers had been brave, their tanks had been superior in quality, and yet they had been crushed by an enemy whose primary advantage was the ability to build and deliver more equipment than Germany could ever hope to destroy. Looking back at the war, historians have puzzled over why German military leadership failed to grasp the implications of Allied industrial superiority until it was far too late to matter. The information was available. German intelligence services provided reports on American and Soviet production capacity. German officers who visited the United States before the war had seen American factories and understood their scale. Yet somehow, the German high command continued to believe that they could win through superior tactics, better technology, and the fighting spirit of their soldiers. Part of this blindness came from ideology. Nazi racial theories taught that Slavic peoples were inferior and that Americans were soft and decadent. It was psychologically difficult for German leaders to accept that these supposedly inferior peoples could outproduce and outfight the master race. Hitler himself repeatedly dismissed warnings about Allied production, insisting that the numbers were propaganda and exaggerations. When confronted with evidence that they were real, he claimed quality would overcome quantity, a belief he held until the final days in his bunker. Part of the blindness came from early success. The victories of 1939 to 1941 seemed to prove that German methods were correct. When those methods stopped working, rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions, German leaders blamed individual failures, bad luck, or sabotage. They could not accept that they had been wrong about something as basic as how to fight a modern industrial war. Part of the blindness came from institutional arrogance. The German General Staff considered itself the finest military organization in the world, heir to the traditions of Frederick the Great and the victories of the Franco-Prussian War. The idea that American industrialists and Soviet commissars understood modern warfare better than German generals was simply unthinkable. By the time reality forced itself upon them, it was too late to change course even if they had wanted to. Behind the statistics of tank production and the strategic analyses of military historians lies a human tragedy that affected millions of people. German soldiers who climbed into tanks knowing they were outnumbered and outsupplied fought with desperate courage, and many died in battles that strategic logic said they could never win. They wrote letters home describing the endless waves of enemy armor and wondering when their own reinforcements would arrive. They grew cynical about promises from headquarters that new wonder weapons would turn the tide. Young men barely out of school were rushed through abbreviated training programs and sent to crew tanks against enemies who had years of experience and unlimited ammunition to practice with. The trauma of fighting against impossible odds affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Allied soldiers paid a price too, even in victory. The American and British tankers who fought in France and Germany knew that their Shermans were vulnerable to German guns. They climbed into tanks that could become death traps if hit in the wrong place, trusting that their numbers and their support system would see them through. Many did not survive, killed in battles that statistics said they should have won easily. The knowledge that more tanks were always available was cold comfort to a crew burning to death in a knocked-out Sherman. Soviet tank crews suffered appalling casualties, thrown into battle in vehicles that were simple to build but offered minimal protection. The T-34 was a good tank by many measures, but Soviet tactical doctrine often treated tanks and their crews as expendable resources. Civilians caught in the path of these massive armored battles suffered most of all. French villages were destroyed by fighting between German defenders and Allied attackers. German cities were fought over street by street as Soviet tanks rolled westward in 1945. The industrial capacity that produced endless streams of tanks also produced the bombs that devastated cities and the artillery shells that turned farmland into moonscapes. The shock that German generals experienced when replacement tanks never stopped coming became a fundamental lesson of modern warfare that shaped military thinking for generations. The United States emerged from World War II with a defense establishment committed to maintaining industrial superiority and logistics excellence. The American military would never again be caught unprepared for mass production warfare. The Cold War that followed saw both superpowers building enormous arsenals and maintaining production capacity that could quickly expand in wartime. The Korean War, just 5 years after World War II ended, demonstrated that the lessons had been learned. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, the initial American response was weak and poorly equipped. But within months, American industrial capacity had geared up, and equipment began flowing to Korea in quantities that overwhelmed the communist forces. The same pattern repeated in Vietnam, where whatever else went wrong with American strategy, there was never a shortage of equipment. The Soviet Union learned similar lessons and built an industrial base designed for mass production of weapons. Soviet doctrine explicitly emphasized quantity and sustainability over individual quality. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and Western observers finally saw inside Soviet factories and warehouses, they found production facilities designed to churn out thousands of tanks in preparation for wars of attrition on a massive scale. Modern military forces still grapple with the quality versus quantity debate. High-tech weapons systems cost enormous amounts of money, which limits how many can be purchased. A modern main battle tank might cost several $1,000,000 and require extensive training to operate effectively. Military planners must balance the desire for the best possible equipment against the need to have enough equipment to fight sustained campaigns. The lessons of World War II suggest that the best tank is the one you have in sufficient numbers, supported by a logistics system that can keep it running, not the theoretical best design that exists in limited quantities. What happened to German generals who watched replacement tanks never stop coming was not just a military defeat but a paradigm shift in how wars would be fought forever after. For centuries, warfare had been about tactics, strategy, the skill of commanders, and the bravery of soldiers. Industrial capacity mattered, but it was one factor among many. World War II proved that in modern warfare between developed nations, industrial capacity was not just important but potentially decisive. The nations that could build more tanks, planes, ships, and guns faster than their enemies could destroy them would win, almost regardless of other factors. This realization transformed how nations prepared for war. Military planning became inseparable from industrial planning. The question was not just how many tanks do we have today, but how many tanks can we build per month if war starts, and can we sustain that production for years? Nations began stockpiling not just weapons, but also machine tools, raw materials, and production facilities that could be converted to military use. The concept of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address was a direct consequence of lessons learned when replacement tanks never stopped coming. The United States and other major powers maintained permanent relationships between defense contractors and the military, ensuring production capacity would exist when needed. The shock that German generals felt was not just about losing battles or even losing the war. It was about the sudden realization that everything they had believed about warfare and everything their professional training had taught them was obsolete. They had prepared to fight the wars of the past with better tactics and better equipment, and they had run into an opponent who had fundamentally changed what war meant. No amount of tactical brilliance or superior tank design could overcome an enemy who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the numbers told a story that was hard to fully comprehend. The United States had produced approximately 88,000 tanks during the war, with the Sherman representing nearly 50,000 of those. Britain had produced around 27,000 tanks and armored vehicles. The Soviet Union had produced over 90,000 tanks, with the T-34 accounting for about 60,000. Combined, the Allies had produced over 200,000 armored fighting vehicles. Germany, fighting desperately to match this production, had built approximately 43,000 tanks and assault guns during the entire war. The disparity was even worse than it appeared, because many of those German vehicles were built in the last years when resources were scarce and quality had declined. Even if every German tank had been a masterpiece of engineering, which many were, the numbers made victory impossible. A German panzer division at full strength might have 200 tanks. If that division fought a battle and lost half its strength, it might take 3 to 6 months to rebuild, assuming parts and replacement vehicles were available at all. An American armored division at full strength might have 250 Sherman tanks. If it lost half its strength in battle, it could be rebuilt to full strength in 2 weeks, and there would still be thousands of Shermans in reserve. Multiply this difference across dozens of divisions and hundreds of battles, and the outcome was never in doubt once American and Soviet production reached full capacity. The German generals who experienced the shock of endless replacement tanks were not stupid or incompetent. They were professionals trained in a military tradition that emphasized excellence, quality, and tactical skill. They had simply failed to recognize that war had changed, that industrial capacity had become the dominant factor, and that their enemies understood this new reality better than they did. Their shock was the shock of discovering that the rules had changed, and no one had told them until it was far too late. In the end, the story of German generals being shocked when replacement tanks never stopped coming is not just a story about tanks or even about World War II. It is a story about how the modern world works, about how industrial capacity and logistical systems can overcome almost any other advantage, and about how dangerous it is to fight the future with ideas from the past. The German High Command entered the war believing that spirit, skill, and superior technology would bring victory. They discovered too late that they were fighting nations whose economies dwarfed their own, and whose industrial systems could produce war materials on a scale that made German production look like a cottage industry. The young German tank commander who stood in the ruins of a French village watching another wave of Shermans approach represents a moment of terrible clarity that would define the rest of the 20th century. He and thousands like him realized in that moment that they were not just losing a battle or even a war, but that their entire understanding of how wars worked was wrong. The confidence that German generals felt in the early years of the war, based on real victories and genuine tactical superiority, collapsed when confronted with an opponent who simply kept coming no matter how many times they were knocked down. The legacy of this shock continues to shape how modern military forces think about procurement, logistics, and industrial preparation. No major military power wants to find itself in the position Germany occupied, unable to replace losses and watching helplessly as better supplied enemies grind them down. The eternal tension between quality and quantity, between sophisticated expensive weapons and simple cheap ones that can be mass-produced, continues to define defense debates in every country. The Sherman tank, dismissed by German tankers as inferior during the war, became a symbol of American industrial might precisely because of what it represented. Not the best tank, but a good enough tank that could be built in unlimited numbers and kept running under the worst conditions. sometimes good enough, multiplied by overwhelming numbers and sustained by an unbreakable supply chain, is better than perfection that arrives too late and in too small quantities. That lesson, learned in shock and horror by German generals from Normandy to Berlin, remains one of the enduring truths of modern warfare.